Black Lives Matter movement is based on lies. Lies about America and lies about Israel.
So there's a fundamental relationship between black people in the US and the Palestinian struggle, and that's connected through legacies of imperialism and colonialism by the United States. So we as black people are one of the largest, most oppressed groups by the United States, and Palestinians are one of the largest groups oppressed by US imperialism by way of the Israeli state.
You know, looking at Trump's America, which is so much like Netanyahu's Israel.
The Palestinian struggle must be linked to black struggle.
Free Palestine.
And when I say Palestine, I mean all of historic Palestine, from river to sea.
For BLM, black lives only matter when it's a white cop taking a black life. They are silent when it comes to the thousands and thousands of black-on-black homicides that are going on across the nation. In 2019, there were a total of 9 unarmed black men killed by the police. There were 48 police officers murdered in that same time period. If the BLM movement really cared about black lives, they'd be in Chicago and Washington and Detroit trying to get black gangs to stop killing each other. This was tweeted by BLM in DC. Black Lives Matter means defund the police. Defund the police? One of the government's only duties is the safety and security of its people. How exactly are you supposed to do that without police?
I don't have any more faith in charges and convictions. I want to rely on this demand of defunding. I think that is our next stage of the work.
What's happening politically in Minneapolis is absolutely horrifying. Between Jeremiah Ellison, the city councilman who is about abolishing the police department, not defunding it, abolishing it completely. And this is the son of Minnesota's Attorney General, Keith Ellison. And you have Minneapolis Pajama Boy Mayor Jacob Fry getting booed out of a BLM event for not agreeing to abolish the police department. Here you have infamous anti-Semite and Israel hater, the Congressman Ilhan Omar, calling to dismantle the police.
Not only do we need to disinvest in police, but we need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department.
The people calling to abolish the police are not calling for an end to racism in America. They're actually calling for an end to America itself.
If people haven't understood that the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter is indeed a radical movement, then they haven't understood the movement at all. From the very beginning, we've been opposed to white supremacy, to capitalism, imperialism, militarism, etc. And so the movement for Black Lives platform, specifically around investment and divestment or prison abolition or Palestine, is very consistent with the values and politics that the member groups of the movement for Black Lives have always held.
Yeah, I'd say opposition to capitalism is a little radical.
What we are saying is that we've put out a vision for our liberation, for our people, that includes things like the defunding of the police, releasing of all our political prisoners.
And when he says release political prisoners, what he means is release cop killers.
In the first comprehensive policy platform, a coalition of African-American activist groups calls Israel an apartheid state.
It's quite the opposite of apartheid. In fact, they have 15 out of 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset. Arabs here are doctors, lawyers, police officers, in the army. It's not apartheid.
Waging a genocide against Palestinians.
Right, so the Agenda for Black Lives Matter states that Israel is complicit in committing a genocide against the Palestinian people.
Genocide of the Palestinians? Is that why there are 5 times more of them today than there was the day that Israel was created?
That great catastrophe in 1948.
So they believe that the creation of Israel was a catastrophe.
70 years after the Nakba, 70 years after Palestinian land was stolen.
Stolen? If returning to your ancestral homeland of over 3,500 years is stealing.
They propose ending U.S. military aid to Israel and instead spending that money on social programs at home.
As long as the United States continues to dump money into the Israeli military, into Israeli soldiers, into Israeli roads that are used to divide Palestinians, as long as our money goes into checkpoints, we'll never have justice.
How are checkpoints that prevent terrorists from blowing themselves up in groups of civilians keeping American blacks from justice?
Every time we write a check, we're supporting an Iron Dome that is used to to justify the disproportionate force of Israel into Gaza.
Iron Dome is strictly used to intercept incoming rockets and missiles. It is never used as an offensive weapon, and it's certainly never been shot into civilian areas in Gaza.
If we're talking about the relevance between Chicago and Palestine, the billions of dollars that are spent or given by the US to Israel and Egypt and Jordan to maintain the occupation could very easily be spent on education, on healthcare, on social welfare for us in the United States.
So when you get into Congress, will you vote against US military aid for Israel?
Absolutely.
Foreign aid to Israel is actually an investment for America. It makes it money and creates jobs.
We see the connections between the police, right here in DC. We see police going to Israel to be trained, coming back using tactics almost exactly like we're seeing in Jerusalem. When you see DC police drive around with lights on, no matter what's happening, that's a tactic they picked up from the Israeli security forces.
Boy, cops driving around with their lights on is real oppressive. It's actually a means to prevent crime by letting people know that there's a police presence.
Can somebody remind me of a staunch pro-Israel organization that has come out in support or stood up against the killing of unarmed black people by law enforcement in this country? If you know one, I want to know who they are, because I don't see that happening, right?
Linda, Jews and Jewish organizations around the world have denounced police brutality and specifically what happened to George Floyd. Might be a little bit before your time, but Jews were actually at the forefront of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, like Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwimmer, who were murdered in Mississippi in 1964.
That the same people who justified the massacres of Palestinian children and innocent civilians in Palestine and call it collateral damage are the same people that will find excuses to justify murders of unarmed people in this country by law enforcement.
If that's not stoking the flames of anti-Semitism, I don't know what is. Maybe that played a little role in why blacks were attacking Jews in New York on an everyday basis prior to the COVID-19 lockdown, or why vandals and looters were targeting Jewish-owned stores and synagogues in Los Angeles. And Linda, why have I never heard you say anything about your Muslim brothers and sisters still slave trading black Africans to this very day?
Some people are being sold.
Yes.
Some people are being sold. Is this something you've heard about? Can you tell us about
Sure.
that? Tell us.
I was sold.
What happened?
On my way coming, I was sold.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee said that Israel is wrong, that Zionism is an evil.
Zionism is evil? Well, Martin Luther King equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Martin Luther King was also a big supporter of the state of Israel.
Israel must exist and has a right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
Palestine will once again be returned to its rightful owners.
Well, on that I agree with you. Judea and Samaria will return to full Jewish sovereignty.
Violence can be defeated, although violence can defeat too.
They let the truth slip out every now and then.
When I stood in the West Bank, there were black people out there screaming, Philistine Hurrah.
Palestine Hurrah Hurrah.
Palestine Hurrah Hurrah.
Ihtilal Barra Barra.
Ihtilal Barra Barra. And there were Arabs screaming Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter.
Americans, get off your knees and stop apologizing for things that you're not guilty of. Please, try and see the truth. White police officers are not hunting down unarmed black men. The Israeli army is not hunting down unarmed Arabs. Don't believe the lies that BLM is saying and that the mainstream media is parroting.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
And come November, everyone, please vote intelligently.
And I will say this about the DNC. I'm a delegate to the DNC.
Yeah.